The city-sized hatch segment in Australia is becoming increasingly tightly contested, with fewer options and the pressure really on to deliver higher spec and safety at a reasonable price. For today's comparison test, we've grabbed 3 of the most recently updated examples to stick them head to head. 2 of our cars here are facelifts. Over here we have the model year 21 Kia Rio GT-Line. And over here we have the Suzuki Swift Series II GLX Turbo. And this purple car here is the outlier. It's the Toyota Yaris SX and it's new from the ground up and not the hybrid version. Which one will pull ahead? Before we find out, remember to read the full written breakdown over on carsguide.com.au. And if you're enjoying our reviews and comparison tests, remember to hit like, remember to hit subscribe, and remember to hit the bell notification icon to stay up to date with all of our latest content.
First things first, let's look at which grades we have here and what kind of value they represent. Our Suzuki Swift is the upper mid-grade GLX Turbo. It sits above the entry-level Swift but below the Swift Sport hot hatch. The GLX Turbo comes in at a smidge over 25 grand before on-roads and brings with it a bespoke engine and transmission from the rest of the Swift range. Then there's the Rio. We've got it here in the GT-Line grade, and despite being the top of the Rio range, it's the cheapest car here, wearing an MSRP of just over $24,000. Finally, we have the new generation Toyota Yaris. It's the mid-grade SX without the brand's renowned hybrid system, and it's the most eyebrow-raising car here due to its upfront cost. At over $27,000, it's by far the most expensive of the 3. On the standard spec front, we won't bore you with every detail, apart from some key ones and the main differences between each car. All cars have a decently sized multimedia touchscreen with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto connectivity, although the Rio gets a larger screen than the others with wireless Apple CarPlay but loses the sat-nav as seen in the Yaris and Swift. The Yaris gets 15-inch wheels, while the Swift gets 16-inch wheels and both get LED headlights. The Rio scores larger 17-inch wheels wrapped in expensive Continental tyres. The Rio has to make do with halogen projector headlights and loses out in other areas, with both the Yaris and Swift scoring keyless entry and push-start ignition, as well as adaptive cruise control. There are also some differences on the active safety front, which we'll check out later. Take a look at the table on screen and hit pause if you want to see the full set of spec differences between each car. Which pulls ahead here? In terms of sheer value, the Swift GLX Turbo packs the most kit for the least coin, but only just. In terms of design, each of these recently refreshed hatchbacks takes its own path. The Rio stands apart from the other 2 with its macho design and squared-off angles, while the Swift and Yaris are a bit more curvy. It's down to taste here, but I think the Yaris is the more sophisticated looking of the 3 with its subtle bodywork, tidy alloys and neat detail elements. It's the inside where these cars diverge quite a lot.
The Swift definitely has the most budget interior of these 3. You can sort of tell by the nasty plastics used in the dash cladding, and the design kind of does date it a little bit in here. I do like that it's got a leather-bound steering wheel, and I do like that it has all the connectivity that you can expect, including sat-nav, which is a nice touch. But the media system also lacks tactile shortcut buttons, and it doesn't have any ergonomic dials for easy access either. It's also quite low down in the dash design, meaning you need to look further away from the road, and the software on it is also laggy and a little bit nasty compared to the other 2 cars. The overall design of this car also feels very tall and narrow, and it almost feels like my seating position's like an SUV seating position. I'm sitting very high up, and I'm looking down on all the elements in this car as well. But I do have a real abundance of headroom in here. Then there's the seat trim. It looks really basic in here, but it's actually really supportive, and the foam it's made of you just sink into, making it comfortable over long trips. What can I say about the back seat of the Swift? Well, it's surprisingly spacious in here, even for someone my size. I've got heaps of room for my knees and I have heaps of headroom too, although that window line does descend a lot, making it a little more awkward to get in and out of than the other 2 cars, and there's also an element of claustrophobia coming in from that low panel too. The trims are really basic back here though. This door cladding is just one single piece of nasty plastic. There's nowhere really to put my elbow that's comfortable. And then there's the seat trim. Even though it does have that nice foam that you sink into like it does in the front seats, it just lacks any bolstering of any kind, and it lacks the finish of the other two cars as well. Finally, and just like the other two cars, there's no adjustable rear air vents in here, and there's not even a power outlet either. The Rio definitely has the most conservative, sporty and spacious interior of the three choices here. What's clear immediately when you sit down is just how much room you have thanks to this light headlining and these big windows, and the amount of room I have for my knees is really impressive too. I think it has maybe a little less headroom, but it's not something that's going to bother you either. Pride of place here in the dash is this huge 8-inch multimedia screen, which is an inch larger than in the other two cars, and it also has wireless Apple CarPlay, although there's a bit of give and take there because we found it to be a bit glitchy on the connection. Also, Kia's really thought of the ergonomics. Here on this nice sporty wheel, there's plenty of buttons and toggles that make it really easy to operate everything while you're driving, and there are shortcut buttons and dials for the screens and climate unit too. I really like the seat trim in the Rio. It looks really cool, but it's not as supportive as it is in the Swift and not as comfortable over long distances as it is in the Yaris. Finally, there's other little design elements in here that I like too. The dash is really mature in terms of its design, and when it comes to armrests, there's a few thoughts as well. They're slightly padded, which is kind of nice and offsets the hard plastics in the door trims, and this is the only car which has a center console armrest. Excellent. The back seat of the Rio, again, super light, super airy, super spacious. I feel like I have more room in here than I do in either of the other cars, even though the headroom seems maybe a little bit lower than the other two. So if you're super tall, that might be a downside. Legroom I have heaps of, and there's nice stitched trim on the back of the seats and even down here in the center row. It's just that little 10% extra that Kia's gone to on the back seat here. There's no adjustable air vents like either of the other two cars, but it does get a single USB outlet. Here in the Yaris, and it's hard not to be disappointed by the interior quality given your extra spend. It's still all hard plastics in here with some quite nasty finishes around. But what I do like is the cool design of everything. It's much more modern than the other two cars. I like this wheel, which has a nice leather bound touch to it. I like the funky dash cluster, and I like the cascading design of the dash, which has lots of little nooks and crannies in it. Finally, there's the seats in the Yaris, and they kind of split the difference of the other two cars. They're not as spongy or supportive as the ones in the Swift, but they're also more supportive than the ones in the Rio, which is nice, and they are comfortable over long trips. Here in the back seat of the Yaris, there's enough space for an adult my size, which is pretty impressive all things considered. I have enough room for my knees and plenty of room for my head, although it does feel a little bit claustrophobic in here, and that's just because those windows are tinted and they're quite small, and the body paneling here comes up quite high too. I think if you're a kid, it would be very enclosed in here. Also, it's missing a little bit of that design spice that it has in the front. It's still a hard plastics show. There's not much on the back of the seats here, and there's no soft armrests for your elbows either. Just like all the other cars here, there's no rear adjustable air vents, and there's no power outlet back here either.
Okay, so how about cabin storage? The Swift gets awkwardly placed front cup holders, bottle holders with small trenches in the doors, and a small third bottle holder for rear passengers, and a binnacle for your phone. The Yaris gets smallish dual cup holders for front passengers, bottle holders with trenches in the doors, as well as a third dual-purpose cup holder and binnacle for rear passengers. Rear doors just hold our demo bottle, and the Yaris has a useful binnacle under the climate unit for a phone and an odd extra one cut out of the dash. Finally, there's the Rio, which offers large cup holders for front passengers, a useful center console box and armrest, a large binnacle for a phone with extra shelf, and a large binnacle in the door. The rear doors couldn't fit our demo bottle though. Boot space in the Swift is noticeably limited, with barely enough room for our largest CarsGuide travel case on its own. The Rio really impresses here with a massive boot that could almost be in the class above. Meanwhile, the Toyota Yaris splits the difference with a small but usable luggage area. Under the bonnet of all three cars, there are very similar engines. The Kia Rio GT-Line and Swift GLX Turbo both score 1-litre 3-cylinder turbocharged petrol engines of reasonably similar power output. The outlier is the Yaris, which has a larger 3-cylinder engine which loses the turbo, but still keeps up on the power front. The main differences come in the transmissions, with the Yaris scoring a continuously variable automatic, the Swift scoring a 6-speed torque converter auto, and the Rio getting a 7-speed dual clutch auto. But what are they like behind the wheel? Let's find out.
First thing you'll notice here in the Rio is how good the visibility is out of it. It's definitely the best of these three cars. It's got massive windows and easy to use side mirrors too. The next thing you'll notice is going to be the steering, because it's artificially weighted in all the drive modes, and it's weighted in the wrong direction too. In eco mode, which we're in now, the steering's weirdly heavy, and then as you work your way from normal to sport, it lightens up to the point where sport is actually a little bit too light. Of those driving modes as well, I think sport mode really suits this car the best. It brings the best characteristics out of its engine and transmission, and it lightens up that steering, and it feels just a little bit more real. Even though this car is the least powerful of our three on test here, it feels nice and aggressive and bitey thanks to that early turbo surge. It does have a little bit of lag, and you can catch that 7-speed dual clutch auto off guard on occasion, but aside from that, it's fun. In one of our more spirited drive loops in the national park, we did notice that the Continental tyres on this car really play to its advantage. It stayed so under control in all the corners, and it really makes this car the best for steering on a curvy road. The Kia's real downside is it is sporty to a fault when it comes to the chassis and the suspension. It's really firm, and as a city car, that kind of detracts from it quite a lot. You do end up bouncing around back and forth, and it is noisy and rattly, and it does knock you about a bit, and that can get tiresome if you're driving it on city roads every day. Behind the wheel of the Yaris, and you can really tell where a lot of that extra cash has gone, it's into the development of this car's underpinnings. It's so smooth and gentle, and the ride quality is just, for this class, very supple. The steering in this car also has the best balance out of all the cars on this test, with light feel, but enough feeling being communicated from the front wheels too. Also, this car is the only one on this test without a turbocharger, but it really does keep up on power, and even though it is a CVT auto and without that turbo, it still feels like it keeps up with the others. I don't feel like I'm wanting for power in this car. The CVT auto is also an interesting one because it feels like a torque converter. I don't feel like it's got that rubber bandy feeling, and that's to be applauded. So even though it's healthy on power and the transmission is actually really good too, the engine is really noisy. It's definitely under load. It's the noisiest of the three cars here, and that's despite the fact that the sound deadening coming from the road is really good in this car. So you don't hear the suspension as much, you don't hear tire roar as much, but that engine ruins the immersion. But again, that's where the Yaris excels the most, and that's in its suspension and ride quality and chassis feel. It filters out all the small bumps on the road really well, while even larger bumps are sprung nicely. And the same can't be quite said for the Kia or the Swift. Also worthy of note is the safety systems in the Yaris. They're very subtle and unintrusive, which is really appreciated. That adaptive cruise system makes it a much more friendly car on the freeway. Okay, so here in the Swift, the first thing I notice is visibility out that rear window is quite a bit limited compared to the other two cars on this test. The steering is nice and light, maybe a little bit too light. Especially at lower speeds, it kind of loses its confidence, like just a little bit. It also has a more traditional 6-speed torque converter automatic, so it doesn't have those weird quirks of either a CVT or a dual clutch. It's a much more traditional drivetrain. This 3-cylinder turbo is the most powerful of the 3.2, and that means you can definitely still have some fun in this car. Ride-wise, it's not quite as comfortable as the Yaris, but also not quite as sporty as the Rio. It sort of falls in between. But the one area where I think it does lack a little bit is its torsion bar rear end, which is much firmer than the front, and that can lead to some uneven moments over bumps. The way that the multimedia is set up, as we said before, is quite distracting with how far you have to take your eyes off the road, and the safety systems as well can be quite intrusive. The lane keep's okay, that's usually the one that we flag the most, but the forward collision warning is downright annoying in stop-start traffic. The noise levels on offer here are pretty good despite all that thin sheet metal. The engine's distant, the road is pretty distant, on most surfaces. It's really on the freeway where it starts to get a bit noisier, and well, it's a city car, so what do you expect? So looking back at each of these cars, well, you've got the Rio, that's sort of your more performance, your fun choice here, especially with that aggressive rubber. Then you've got the Yaris, that's more of your comfort choice, and this car, the Swift, it sort of falls in the middle. It's still fun to drive, but still pretty comfortable too, and as the value choice in this segment, that's to be appreciated.
On a side note, the Swift is the only car here with paddle shifters, but the only car that actually feels like it needs them is the Rio. While we've rattled on about the differences between each of these cars, it's also worth noting that there's no real deal breakers here, and they're more or less matched behind the wheel if made for slightly different tastes. R3 cars might appear to be fuel slippers, but is that really the case in the real world? Over our testing loop measured at the pump, every car in this test overshot its official combined number by at least 30%, with each car consuming at least 7.4 litres per 100 kilometres. The Yaris was the closest to its claim, while the Rio overshot by the most significant margin. A major factor that's contributing to city cars pushing further up the price scale is safety equipment, and all of these cars have at least some very welcome active gear. All cars have at least auto emergency braking, lane keep assist, and lane departure warning, but the Swift jumps ahead by adding blind spot monitoring and adaptive cruise. The Rio misses out on blind spot monitoring and adaptive cruise control, while the Yaris misses out on blind spot at this grade, but gains auto high beams and traffic sign recognition. The Yaris is also notable for its stellar ANCAP score to the latest, most stringent standards, an impressive 8 airbag complement, making this category a close call between it and the Swift. For a full breakdown of key safety items, hit pause for the table on screen. The Yaris and the Swift both have 5-year and unlimited kilometre warranties, while the Rio seems to storm ahead with its 7-year and unlimited kilometre coverage. The tables are turned when it comes to service pricing though, with the Yaris being by far the cheapest car to service, followed by the Swift in the middle, and then the Rio as the most expensive by quite some margin. Again, check our table here for a summary of the key ownership facts.
Now, we ran the numbers against our 8 review criteria you can read all about on site over at carsguide.com.au in the detailed comparison review. But even though these cars have each of their pros and cons, there wasn't really a clear winner here, and that surprised even us. What we can tell you though is each car will suit a different buyer. The Swift here, for example, represents that value choice. You get the most spec and safety at a very reasonable price. Then there's the Yaris. There's no getting around its awkwardly tall pricing, which really sort of sets it back here. But we still think it'll suit a buyer who's less value conscious and maybe thinking more about a small car in this category that's comfortable to drive, even over those long periods. We asked each other which one we'd rather own for 6 months, and the Yaris really was top of mind just for that comfort, that refinement that is on offer there. Then finally, there's the Rio. Now the Rio is for someone who's really looking for a bit more excitement. It's the corner carver of these 3, and it is the most fun behind the wheel. Where it's hampered is that busyness of the suspension, the noise that penetrates the cabin. It's just not quite as refined as these other 2. It's not quite as livable, but it is fun, and it is surprisingly the most practical of the 3 too. If you enjoyed this review, remember to hit like, remember to hit subscribe, and remember to hit the bell notification icon to stay up to date with all of our latest reviews. Also, which would you pick? Let us know in the comments below.